In the frozen chaos of December 1944, as Hitler gambled his last reserves on a surprise thrust through the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht believed winter itself had become their ally. Fog, snow, and low ceilings grounded Allied air superiority. But in the artillery parks behind American lines, a secret guarded almost as closely as the atomic bomb was about to rewrite the arithmetic of industrial warfare. December 19, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. The snow came down in curtains so thick that visibility ended at 30 meters. Lieutenant James Thornton crouched at the forest edge, binoculars pressed against his frozen face, watching something that should not have been possible. Gray shapes emerged from the white. Not a patrol, not a company, a mass. Hundreds of Volksgrenadiers advancing in waves across the open slope below, their Feldgrau coats blending with the storm, their breath rising in collective clouds. Behind them, the low grumble of Sturmgeschütze grinding forward through the snow-choked forest roads. They came because the sky was closed. They came because American artillery, they believed, could only scratch at the earth. Thornton's hand trembled as he keyed the radio. His voice cracked through static to the fire direction center 3 kilometers back, sheltered in a stone farmhouse basement, where maps covered every wall and the air smelled of coffee and cordite. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open. Grid 284-517. Request VT. The FDC officer, a captain who had not slept in 40 hours, marked the coordinates with a grease pencil. No rotating the fuse dial. No guessing at burst height. Just 2 letters written beside the elevation data. VT. 6 tubes of the 105mm M2A1 howitzers pivoted in unison. Loaders slammed rounds home, each shell crowned with a fuse no larger than a man's fist, each fuse containing what 3 years ago would have been impossible. A miniature radar transmitter, a receiver, a battery engineered to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity, all sealed and silent and waiting. The first salvo left the tubes with a sound like tearing canvas. Thornton watched through the binoculars. He had seen artillery before, geysers of frozen earth, black flowers blooming where shells struck, men diving, crawling, sometimes continuing. This was different. The rounds exploded in the air. Not in the trees, not on impact. In the air itself, 20 meters above the advancing line, as if the sky had learned to arm itself. Each detonation birthed a perfect hemisphere of steel fragments, thousands of them, slicing downward in a mathematical cone of death that ignored cover, ignored prone positions, ignored every lesson the Wehrmacht had learned about surviving indirect fire. The Volksgrenadiers did not dive. There was nowhere to dive to. The fragments found them in the open, found them in the shallow depressions, found them as they turned to run. The wave did not slow. It simply ceased to exist as a coherent force. Thornton lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking, but not from cold. The second wave came 15 minutes later. Doctrine demanded it. The attack plan required it. Somewhere behind the German lines, an SS officer who had never seen what VT could do was shouting orders into a field telephone, demanding the breakthrough that High Command had promised. The American guns fired again. Same grid, same fuse setting, same result. This time the wave broke before it reached the tree line. Men scattered into the forest margins, seeking any vertical cover, abandoning unit cohesion for the animal mathematics of survival. The Stugs ground to a halt, their infantry screen evaporated, suddenly alone in an equation that no longer balanced. By nightfall, the snow around Elsenborn Ridge was no longer white. The 2nd Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division, 2 units that were supposed to have collapsed under the weight of the 6th Panzer Army, still held their positions. The guns behind them were cool enough to touch, their barrels barely warm, because VT required fewer rounds to achieve what impact fuses could not guarantee. In the German command posts, reports filtered back through static and confusion, phrases that made no technical sense. Explosions in the air, fire that hangs like a ceiling, shells that know where we are. Intelligence officers marked the reports, filed them, sent them up the chain. But by then the arithmetic had already turned against the offensive. The Wehrmacht had counted on winter. They had counted on fog and low clouds to blind American air power. They had not counted on the air itself becoming weaponized. In the artillery parks, crews stacked the spent casings in neat pyramids. On each casing, stenciled in black paint, a designation that would remain classified until the war ended. VT, variable time. A name that revealed nothing and promised everything. Thornton spent that night in a frozen foxhole, listening to the wounded calling from the slope below, their voices growing fainter as the temperature dropped. He thought about the rounds he had called in, about how they exploded in places where nothing solid existed, about how the sky had learned to kill. The Germans would attack again. Doctrine demanded it. Pride demanded it. The offensive plan, stamped and approved by Hitler himself, demanded it. But mathematics is indifferent to doctrine. And the Americans had just introduced a new variable into the equation, one that rendered every German tactical assumption obsolete. The shells kept coming. Crate after crate, each fuse inspected by hand, each one a small miracle of miniaturization and mass production, rolling forward on trucks through the snow-choked roads of Belgium. And every time the Germans massed for an assault, the sky opened and taught them the same lesson. Some truths arrive slowly, through experience and adaptation. Others arrive all at once, in bursts of light and steel 20 meters above your head, too fast to learn from and too late to survive. The winter was supposed to be their shield. Instead, it became their tomb. December 16, 1944, 3 days earlier. The offensive began in darkness, with artillery barrages that turned the frozen Ardennes into a landscape of fire. Searchlights bounced off low clouds, creating artificial daylight for the advancing columns. The Wehrmacht called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deception name meant to suggest defense when every gun pointed west. The Americans never saw it coming. Along an 80-kilometer front, Volksgrenadier divisions and SS Panzer units punched through thinly held positions, scattering entire regiments, capturing fuel dumps, seizing crossroads before anyone could organize a coherent defense. Within hours, the front line ceased to exist as a line at all. It became a fluid chaos of surrounded units, cut telephone wires and roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the maps showed a bulge growing in the American lines like a tumor. Bastogne would soon be surrounded. St. Vith was fighting for survival. And everywhere, the weather reports came back the same. Fog, snow, ceiling zero. No air support possible, no observation, no relief from above. The German High Command studied those weather reports with something approaching religious gratitude. They had planned this offensive around a single meteorological fact. Winter in the Ardennes meant Allied air power would be grounded. Without the fighter bombers, without the observation planes, the Americans would have to fight on equal terms, and the Wehrmacht still knew how to fight. Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed the initial reports with satisfaction. Penetrations exceeded expectations. American units were fragmenting. The roads to Antwerp lay open theoretically if the momentum could be sustained. All they needed was another week of fog, another week of low ceilings, another week of blindness from above. They would get 3 days. But even before the weather broke, something else was already breaking their offensive. Something they could not see and did not understand. Something that had begun years earlier, in laboratories and testing ranges thousands of kilometers away, in a race against physics itself. Baltimore, Maryland, 1940. The project started with a problem that seemed unsolvable. Anti-aircraft artillery was fundamentally ineffective. Bombers flew too high, too fast, in formations too dispersed for impact-fused shells to hit directly. Time fuses, mechanical clockwork set before firing, required gunners to estimate altitude, speed, and trajectory under combat conditions. The mathematics were brutal. A bomber had to pass within 50 meters of an explosion to suffer serious damage. In three-dimensional space with all variables uncertain, the odds approached zero. Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Carnegie Institution, looked at the problem differently. What if the shell could decide when to detonate? What if it could sense its own proximity to a target? The idea was simple. The execution was not. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, transmit a signal, receive the reflection, measure the time delay. You have distance. The problem was making it small enough to fit in an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive being fired, reliable enough to work in combat, and cheap enough to mass-produce by the millions. Oh, and it had to work after experiencing 20,000 times the force of gravity when the gun fired. By 1942, they had a prototype, a fuse the size of a fist, containing vacuum tubes so small they had to be assembled under magnifying glasses, a battery that activated on firing, a transmitter and receiver that could measure the Doppler shift of reflected radio waves, and trigger a detonator when the signal indicated the shell was within lethal range of something solid. They called it the Variable Time Fuse, VT. The name was deliberate misdirection. It sounded like an improved time fuse, something evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The truth was classified at a level approaching the Manhattan Project. The Navy tested it first against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. The results were immediate and devastating. Surface ships equipped with 5-inch guns and VT fuses shot down kamikazes at ranges and rates that had been impossible weeks before. One cruiser commander reported hitting 14 aircraft in a single engagement, a tally that would have been extraordinary for an entire fleet with conventional fuses. Then came the V-1 flying bombs. London's defenders had been using conventional anti-aircraft tactics with marginal success, impact fuses that had to score direct hits on a target traveling at 600 kilometers per hour. When they switched to VT-fused 90mm shells, the intercept rate tripled. 80% of the flying bombs launched at London after August 1944 were destroyed before reaching the city. The British commanders looked at those numbers and asked the obvious question: why isn't this being used on the ground? The American answer was equally obvious: security. Every VT fuse that failed to detonate was a potential gift to German engineers. If they captured one intact, if they reverse-engineered the principle, the advantage would evaporate. Worse, they might use it themselves. So the policy was absolute. VT fuses could only be used over water or in areas where recovery by the enemy was impossible. Not in North Africa, not in Italy, not in France. Until December 1944. Somewhere in the decision chain, the exact moment remains unclear in the records, someone made a calculation. The risk of German capture versus the cost of losing the Ardennes. The probability of reverse engineering versus the certainty of American casualties. The time required to copy the technology versus the time remaining in the war. The numbers favored release. On December 16th, as the German offensive erupted across the Ardennes, authorization came down through artillery command. VT fuses were cleared for ground use in the European theater. Fire direction centers were briefed. Gunners were trained in procedures that seemed absurdly simple compared to the complexity of the weapon itself. Mark VT on the fire mission, set elevation and deflection, fire. The fuse would handle the rest. Crates of VT-fused ammunition moved forward through the snow. Security protocols remained strict. Destroy any unexploded rounds. Never fire VT in areas that might be overrun. Never discuss the technology over unsecured communications. But the weapon was released. The Germans, meanwhile, continued to attack. Their entire operational plan depended on weather that prevented observation and airstrikes. Their infantry tactics assumed that American artillery would crater the ground but leave covered positions intact. Their assault formations massed in relatively tight spacing because roads through the Ardennes forests were narrow and timeline was everything. Every one of those assumptions was about to collide with a fuse the size of a man's fist. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions prepared their positions. Behind them, artillery battalions registered their guns, plotting defensive fire missions across every approach, every likely avenue of advance. The coordinates went into the fire direction centers. The ammunition went into the ready magazines. And on each shell, in place of the familiar mechanical time fuse or impact fuse, a small cylindrical device painted olive drab, marked with a simple designation, VT. The German attacks came in waves, confident in the fog, certain that American firepower would be blunted by the weather and the terrain. They were wrong about both, but they would not understand why until it was far too late. December 20th, 1944, Crinkled Rosherath, Northern Shoulder. The twin villages sat like knuckles on the map, blocking the road network the Germans needed to exploit their breakthrough. For 3 days, SS Panzer Grenadiers and Volksgrenadiers had thrown themselves at the American positions, expecting the defenses to crack like they had everywhere else. Instead, they found a killing ground that defied every tactical manual. Captain Wilhelm Osterhold led his company through the forest approach in the pre-dawn darkness, moving in the textbook formation drilled into every Wehrmacht infantry officer, loose enough to avoid massed casualties from a direct hit, tight enough to maintain unit cohesion and control. 30 meters of frontage, men spaced at 5-meter intervals. Behind them, the 2nd Company. Behind that, the 3rd. A human battering ram designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer mass and determination. The American forward observer saw them through a break in the trees, thermal signatures in the snow, movement where there should be stillness. He called the mission with practiced economy. Coordinates, formation type, enemy strength estimated at battalion level. The Fire Direction Center officer marked the target on his plotting board. Drew the sheaf of fire. 6 howitzers, each tube assigned a slightly different impact point to create overlapping coverage. Then, beside the elevation and deflection data, he wrote 2 letters that would have meant nothing to Osterhold or any of his men. VT. The shells traveled in parabolic arcs through the darkness. Inside each fuse, the battery activated. The miniature radar transmitter began pulsing at a rate of hundreds of times per second, sending radio waves forward in an invisible cone. The receiver listened for echoes. At first, only the weak return signal of empty air and distant trees. The circuits remained unarmed. Then, as the shells descended and the angle changed, something denser appeared below. Ground clutter, vegetation, the massed metal of weapons and equipment. Human bodies in sufficient concentration to reflect a measurable signal. The Doppler shift indicated decreasing distance. The return signal strengthened past the threshold. The firing circuits closed. The shells detonated at precisely 23 meters altitude. Osterhold never heard the explosions. The sound and the steel arrived simultaneously. What he experienced was simply the sudden transformation of air into a substance capable of killing. Fragments sleeted downward in mathematically perfect cones, each explosion covering a circle 40 meters in diameter. The patterns overlapping to create a ceiling of death that extended across the entire company front. Men dropped without understanding why. There was no impact point to avoid, no crater to use for cover. The fragments came from above, through the trees, into the shallow depressions where soldiers instinctively sought protection. Prone positions offered no advantage. Cover meant nothing unless it had a roof. The company ceased to exist as a tactical unit in under 30 seconds. The 2nd Company, following 200 meters behind, saw the sky light up ahead, saw the trees suddenly illuminated, heard the screaming on the radio. They went to ground immediately, spreading out, seeking any overhead protection. The American observer adjusted fire, new coordinates. The FDC plotted. More tubes joined the mission. The same 2 letters written beside every fire mission. VT. The 2nd barrage caught the scattered survivors. Then the 3rd. The artillery wasn't searching for them. It was creating a zone where human survival became a statistical impossibility. By dawn, Osterhold's battalion had lost 2 companies without ever engaging the American infantry. The attack was called off. Not suspended. Called off. The officers couldn't explain what had happened, only that artillery had somehow changed its fundamental nature. Intelligence reports filtered back to division, then corps, then army level. The descriptions were confused, contradictory, impossible. Shells that explode without hitting anything. Fire that creates a roof. Detonations suspended in air. One report used a phrase that would circulate through German positions for the rest of the battle. Stahldecke, ceiling of steel. At Elsenborn Ridge, the math was even more brutal. The Germans needed that high ground to protect their northern flank. Every road network, every supply line, every tactical option depended on neutralizing the American artillery positions on the ridge. So they attacked again. And again. And again. Each attack followed the same pattern, massing in the forest approaches where roads created natural channels, emerging into the killing zones where American observers had pre-registered every grid square, meeting artillery fire that had become geometrically more lethal than anything in their experience. The V-Corps artillery, massed batteries of 105 mm M2A1 howitzers and 155 mm M1 long toms, fired mission after mission with VT fuses. The guns themselves were conventional. The trajectories were conventional. Only the fuse had changed. But that single change altered every equation. A conventional impact fuse required a direct hit or near miss to cause casualties. Probability, low. A mechanical time fuse required perfect estimation of burst height under combat stress. Probability, marginal. VT required only that the shell pass over enemy troops within effective fragmentation range. Probability, near certainty. The artillery crews noticed something else. They were firing fewer rounds per mission. Where a time-fused barrage might require 30 shells to neutralize a company-sized target, VT accomplished the same effect with 12 to 15. The ammunition consumption dropped. The gun barrels stayed cooler. The logistics trains could supply more missions per day. The efficiency was terrifying. By December 21st, German tactical doctrine began to adapt, or try to. Orders came down to increase spacing between soldiers from 5 meters to 15, even 20 meters. Disperse more, move faster through open areas, never mass in the approach. But the Ardennes terrain made dispersion nearly impossible. The forests were dense, the roads were few. The attack timetables demanded concentration of force at the breakthrough points. Spreading out meant losing cohesion, losing speed, losing the synchronized pressure that was supposed to crack American defenses. And when they did spread out, the American artillery simply adjusted. Wider sheaves, more tubes per mission. Fire control that could coordinate multiple battalions on a single target. The VT fuse didn't care about spacing. It just required recalibration. At St. Vith, on the southern approaches, the pattern repeated. German columns funneling through limited road networks. American artillery creating airburst barriers across every avenue of approach. Attacks that should have overwhelmed isolated positions instead bled out in the forest margins, leaving hundreds of casualties who never saw the enemy infantry. In the German command posts, officers stared at maps that no longer made tactical sense. They had the numbers. They had the momentum. They had surprise and weather, and every advantage except one. The Americans had changed the mathematics of killing. And mathematics, unlike courage or ideology, cannot be overcome by willpower. On the night of December 21st, a German Hauptmann, a career officer who had fought from Poland to the gates of Moscow, sat in a cellar command post in Bullingen, writing a report for his regimental commander. His handwriting was precise, methodical, the product of Prussian military training. But the words kept returning to the same impossible conclusion. The enemy has deployed a fuse that detonates in the air without impact. The effect is uniform across the entire beaten zone. Cover provides no protection. The psychological impact on the men is severe. Recommend immediate investigation and countermeasures. The report went up the chain. By the time it reached 6th Panzer Army headquarters, there were dozens like it, all saying the same thing, all describing something that sounded like science fiction. But the bodies were real. The stalled attacks were real. The mathematics were undeniable. The Americans had armed the sky itself, and the sky had no mercy. December 23rd, 1944. The sky opens. The weather broke on the morning of the 6th day. Fog lifted, clouds scattered. For the first time since the offensive began, visibility extended beyond 100 meters. Across the Ardennes, American soldiers looked up and saw blue sky. And the German columns looked up and saw death. The fighter bombers came first. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, laden with bombs and rockets, vectored by ground controllers to every road junction, every identified concentration, every choke point where German units were massing. They flew in relays, one wave replacing another, maintaining continuous pressure from dawn until the light failed. But the VT fuse didn't need daylight. It had been killing in fog and snow since the offensive began. Now it simply had company. The combination was devastating. Airstrikes shattered the German logistics network, fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, command posts. VT artillery made it impossible to concentrate forces for counterattacks or organized withdrawals. Every tactical option led into a kill zone that operated regardless of weather, visibility, or time of day. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd Infantry Division counted the results. 5 days of repeated German assaults, 5 days of VT-fused defensive fires. The ridge had not yielded a single meter. More importantly, the German 6th Panzer Army, the northern spearhead that was supposed to reach the Meuse River and drive for Antwerp, had exhausted itself against a position that should have fallen in the first 48 hours. The entire operational timetable was broken. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the industrial machinery that had created VT continued its relentless output. Production lines in American factories were stamping out fuses at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Each fuse passed through multiple inspection stations. Each vacuum tube was tested individually. Each battery was verified under load. The rejection rate was minimal. The reliability in combat was approaching 90%. By the time the Bulge campaign ended, American forces would have expended over 200,000 VT-fused rounds. Each one represented thousands of man-hours of precision manufacturing, quality control, and logistics. Each one performed exactly as designed, detonating at the optimal altitude to maximize casualties against exposed troops. The Germans had no equivalent. They had the theoretical knowledge. Radio proximity fuses were not beyond German engineering capability. But they didn't have the miniaturization technology, the mass production infrastructure, or the time to develop it. More critically, they didn't have the strategic depth to invest resources in weapons development when every factory was already strained to produce conventional ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles. The war had become a contest of industrial mathematics. And in that contest, the side that could deploy miniature radars by the hundreds of thousands had already won. On December 24th, reports reached German Supreme Command that Bastogne was being relieved. The American 4th Armored Division had punched through from the south, breaking the encirclement that was supposed to have been the death knell of the 101st Airborne. The entire southern shoulder of the offensive was collapsing, but the real collapse was happening in the north, less dramatically but more completely. The 6th Panzer Army, battered by 5 days of VT artillery, and now exposed to constant air attack, was no longer capable of offensive operations. Units were falling back to consolidate, to regroup, to find positions that offered some protection against fire that seemed to come from the air itself. German officers tried to adapt. They dispersed their formations as much as terrain allowed. They moved only at night. They used every scrap of overhead cover, forests, villages, narrow ravines. Some units achieved local successes, penetrating American lines, capturing isolated positions. But they couldn't sustain momentum. The VT artillery was everywhere, coordinated by a fire control network that could mass dozens of tubes on a single grid square within minutes. Every advance was met by airburst fire. Every concentration was spotted and engaged. Every tactical victory dissolved into a Pyrrhic bloodbath that left units too depleted to exploit their gains. The psychological effect was perhaps worse than the physical casualties. Soldiers could accept dying to bullets, to shells, to direct combat where bravery and skill mattered. But VT removed those variables. It didn't matter if you were brave or cowardly, skilled or clumsy, fast or slow. If you were in the grid square when the mission was fired, you died or you didn't. And the determining factor was pure probability. One German veteran, captured near Malmedy in early January, told his interrogators, "We stopped fearing the artillery. We started fearing the air itself. You could hide from impact shells. You could guess when time fuses would burst. But these knew where we were." The statement was technically incorrect. The VT fuse didn't know anything. It simply measured distance and detonated when parameters matched. But the distinction was meaningless to men dying in the snow. By December 26th, the German offensive had transitioned from attack to defense. Units that had advanced 30 kilometers in the first 3 days were now fighting to hold ground, then fighting to retreat in good order. The weather remained clear. Allied air power operated without restriction, and behind every American position, artillery battalions continued to fire VT-fused missions with mechanical efficiency. The 150 mm M1 long Tom howitzers were particularly effective. Their greater range and heavier shell weight meant VT detonations created fragment patterns that could neutralize entire platoons with a single round. Fire missions that had previously required dozens of shells and careful adjustment now achieved decisive effects with minimal expenditure. American logistics officers noted the efficiency gains with satisfaction. Fewer shells per mission meant more missions per day. Less barrel wear meant longer maintenance intervals. The entire artillery system was operating at a tempo the Germans couldn't match even with conventional ammunition. At his headquarters, Field Marshal Model studied the situation maps with growing desperation. The Bulge, that ambitious thrust toward the Meuse, was becoming a salient, a vulnerable protrusion into Allied lines that consumed resources without gaining objectives. Fuel shortages were critical, ammunition stocks were depleting, and everywhere the reports mentioned the same thing: American artillery that detonated in the air, creating casualties out of proportion to the number of rounds fired. Model had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen the Soviet artillery barrages at Kursk, massed fires that had seemed like the maximum expression of industrial firepower. But those had been brute force, thousands of guns, hundreds of thousands of shells, saturating entire sectors with steel and high explosive. This was different. This was surgical, precise, every round maximally efficient, every mission calculated to achieve specific effects with minimum waste. It was the artillery of a nation that had industrialized warfare to the point where even the Fuzes contained more technology than entire German divisions. On December 28th, orders came down from Supreme Command: begin preparations for withdrawal. The offensive had failed. The Bulge would have to be flattened. The troops pulled back to defensible lines. The gamble admitted as lost. The retreat would take weeks. It would be contested every meter by American forces who now had both air superiority and artillery dominance. And through it all, the VT Fuzes would continue to arm the sky, turning every German concentration into a target, every movement into a calculated risk. Some weapons change tactics, some change operations, some change the fundamental nature of combat. VT changed the mathematics of survival itself. And mathematics, in the end, is something no army can defeat through courage alone. January 1945, after the Bulge. The maps told the story in stark simplicity. The German salient that had bulged westward in mid-December had flattened by mid-January. The lines on the map returned roughly to where they had been before the offensive, with one critical difference. The Wehrmacht divisions that had launched the attack no longer existed as effective fighting forces. The casualty figures were devastating. Over 100,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Aircraft losses that the Luftwaffe could not replace. And for what? A few weeks of territorial gains that evaporated under pressure, leaving nothing but wrecked equipment and frozen corpses scattered across the Ardennes. The American casualties were significant, nearly 20,000 dead. But the strategic equation remained clear. The Allies could replace losses. Germany could not. Every panzer destroyed was irreplaceable. Every veteran killed represented training and experience that couldn't be rebuilt. Every liter of fuel consumed was stolen from the defense of the Reich itself. But the true lesson of the Bulge wasn't visible in casualty statistics or territorial control. It lay in something more fundamental: the collision between industrial capability and military ambition. The Germans had planned the offensive around a calculation that was superficially sound. Winter weather would negate Allied air superiority. Surprise would create initial breakthroughs. Speed would prevent the Americans from organizing coherent defense. The math seemed reasonable. What they hadn't calculated was that the Americans had changed the equation itself. VT represented something more profound than a better fuse. It represented the full industrialization of warfare, the application of cutting-edge technology, mass production, and systems integration to the fundamental problem of killing efficiently. It was warfare conducted not by courage or tactical brilliance, but by engineering excellence and logistical supremacy. The Germans had courage. They had tactical brilliance. They had veteran formations and experienced commanders. What they didn't have was the industrial depth to compete with an enemy that could put miniature radar systems into artillery shells and manufacture them by the millions. In the artillery parks behind American lines, crews stacked the empty shell casings in pyramids that grew taller each day. Each casing had once held a VT fuse. Each fuse had performed its function: transmit, receive, calculate, detonate. The mathematics of each explosion were identical: fragment velocity, dispersion pattern, lethal radius. The physics didn't care about ideology or national identity or historical grievance. Physics was neutral. Industrial capacity was not. The German military had entered the war with a doctrine built around Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, rapid maneuver, decisive action by elite formations. It was a philosophy that assumed wars would be short, that initial victories would create cascading collapse in the enemy's will to fight. It was, fundamentally, a gambler's strategy. Bet everything on speed and shock, win quickly, or not at all. The Americans had entered with a different assumption. Wars would be long, industrial, attritional. Victory would come not from brilliant maneuver, but from overwhelming material superiority. Not from elite formations, but from adequately trained masses supported by technological advantage. Not from gambling, but from grinding. The VT fuse was the perfect expression of that philosophy. It didn't require exceptional skill to employ, just competent forward observers, adequate fire direction centers, and reliable logistics. It didn't rely on individual heroism or tactical genius. It simply made every artillery mission more effective, consistently, repeatedly, mathematically. One American artillery officer, interviewed after the war, put it simply: "We didn't need to be better soldiers. We just needed to be better at arithmetic." The lesson extended beyond artillery. The entire American war effort operated on the same principle. Liberty ships produced faster than U-boats could sink them. Tanks manufactured in quantities that dwarfed German production. Aircraft rolling off assembly lines in numbers that turned the sky itself into an American weapon. And behind it all, a continent untouched by bombing, with resources and industrial capacity that no European power could match. The Germans had fought brilliantly. They had inflicted disproportionate casualties in many engagements. They had demonstrated tactical excellence and operational creativity throughout the war. But they were trying to solve an arithmetic problem with geometry, applying elegance and brilliance to a contest that would be decided by multiplication and addition. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin divided the post-war world. The conversation assumed German defeat. The only questions were timing and territorial arrangements. Nobody discussed whether Germany could still win. That calculation had been settled months earlier, in places like Elsenborn Ridge, where mathematics had proven more powerful than courage. The VT fuse would remain classified until after the war ended. Even then, the full technical details stayed secret for years, but the principle became public. Proximity-fused artillery was now standard. Every major military would pursue the technology. The era of impact and time fuses was over. By 1950, VT had evolved into variable time fuses with multiple setting options. By 1960, electronic timing had improved to allow programmable burst heights. By 1970, the descendants of VT included guided munitions that could adjust their trajectory in flight. The principle that began with Merle-Tuve's question, "What if the shell could decide when to detonate?" had become the foundation of modern precision fires. But the original VT fuse, the one used at the Bulge, remained in some ways the purest expression of the concept. No guidance, no complex programming. Just a simple question answered by physics. Is there something solid below me? Yes, detonate. The German soldiers who died under VT fire were no less brave than those who died to bullets or bayonets. The officers who ordered attacks into VT-defended positions were no less competent than those who succeeded elsewhere. The strategic planners who launched the Ardennes offensive were no less intelligent than their Allied counterparts. They were simply on the wrong side of an industrial equation that no amount of courage could balance. Wars are won by many factors: morale, leadership, geography, alliances, luck. But in the industrial age, one factor overshadows all others: the capacity to produce, supply, and employ technology at scale. The side that can put better tools into the hands of adequate soldiers will defeat the side that relies on excellent soldiers with adequate tools. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson across 5 years of war. At the Bulge, they learned it definitively. They were defeated not by weapons but by arithmetic. The truth arrived in fragments of steel, detonating in the air above their heads, and nobody in power dared to believe it until the math was written in bodies across the snow. By then, belief was irrelevant. The equation had already been solved. April 1945, a factory in New Jersey. The production line continued its rhythm even as the war in Europe entered its final weeks. Conveyor belts carried shell casings through stations where workers, mostly women, mostly young, assembled the fuses that had changed warfare. Their hands moved with practiced precision, inserting vacuum tubes no larger than a thumbnail, sealing battery compartments, testing electrical continuity. Each fuse took 17 minutes to assemble. Each one passed through 12 inspection stations. Each one was packed in a wooden crate lined with rubber padding and marked with stenciled letters: VT fuse. Handle with care. The women knew the shells went to Europe. They knew the fuses made artillery more effective. They didn't know the technical details. Those remained classified. They didn't know about Elsenborn Ridge or Krinkelt Rosherath or the mathematics of airburst detonation. They knew they were helping end the war. That was enough. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, American industry had produced over 22 million VT fuses, 22 million miniature radars, each one a small miracle of engineering, each one manufactured to tolerances that would have been impossible a decade earlier. The number was almost incomprehensible. 22 million of anything represented industrial capacity on a scale that only America possessed. 22 million precision instruments, each containing vacuum tubes and batteries and transmitters, produced while simultaneously building aircraft carriers and bombers and tanks and every other implement of modern war. The Germans had captured a few unexploded VT rounds during the Battle of the Bulge. Intelligence officers examined them, photographed them, wrote careful reports about the apparent proximity fusing mechanism. The reports were filed, sent to research departments, studied by engineers who understood immediately what they represented and understood equally that Germany lacked the capacity to replicate them. One German engineer, interviewed after the war, looked at a disassembled VT fuse and said simply, "This would have required our entire electronics industry working exclusively on this single problem for 2 years, and we would still not have achieved the reliability or the scale." The war had been decided by many factors: by the opening of the Second Front, by Soviet mass and resilience, by Allied naval superiority, by strategic bombing, by 1,000 tactical decisions and operational victories. But underlying all of it was a simpler truth: the side with greater industrial capacity had won. The side that could produce not just more weapons, but better weapons, and could produce them in quantities that turned quality into overwhelming quantity. VT was merely the most elegant expression of that advantage. Elsenborn Ridge, December 1989. The forest had grown back. 44 years after the battle, the scars were mostly healed. Trees covered the slopes where Volksgrenadiers had advanced and died. Snow fell quietly, as it had in 1944, but now there was no artillery, no screaming, no sudden transformations of air into death. A memorial stood on the ridge. Simple stone, engraved with unit designations and casualty figures. Tourists came occasionally, mostly in summer, to walk the ground and try to imagine what had happened here. Few could. The mathematics of modern war, the calculations of fragment velocity and burst height and lethal radius, don't translate into human understanding. Numbers on paper, equations in textbooks. They don't convey the reality of men dying under an invisible ceiling of steel, or the desperation of attacking into fire that couldn't be avoided or predicted or survived by any action except retreat. An old man stood at the memorial, reading the names. He had been there in 1944, a forward observer with the 2nd Infantry Division. He had called in the fire missions, had watched through binoculars as VT rounds detonated above German positions, had seen attacks dissolve before reaching American lines. He didn't talk about it much. What could you say? That technology had made killing more efficient? That arithmetic had proven more powerful than courage? That wars in the industrial age were decided in factories long before soldiers ever met on battlefields? All true, all irrelevant to the memory of young men dying in snow. He stood for a moment longer, then walked back to his car. The forest was quiet. The war was history. The fuses that had armed the sky above this ridge were museum pieces now, displayed behind glass with explanatory placards about radio waves and proximity detection and the industrialization of warfare. The lesson remained. Washington, D.C., present day. In the archives of the National Museum of American History, a single VT fuse sits in a display case. The paint has faded. The metal shows traces of corrosion. But the essential components are still visible. The vacuum tubes, the battery compartment, the antenna that transmitted and received the signals that measured distance and triggered detonation. The placard explains the technology in careful, neutral language, describes the development process, notes the casualty ratios, mentions the Battle of the Bulge as a key employment of the weapon. What it cannot convey is the existential shift the weapon represented. Before VT, artillery was powerful but imprecise. After VT, it became a mathematical certainty. Before VT, soldiers could take cover and survive. After VT, survival became a matter of probability distribution curves and fragment dispersion patterns. The most unbreakable walls are not made of steel, but of belief. The Germans believed in their tactical superiority, their veteran formations, their operational brilliance. They believed winter would protect them from American air power. They believed the Ardennes offensive could succeed through speed and shock. All of those beliefs were reasonable given the evidence available to them. All of them shattered against the reality of a fuse the size of a fist. In the end, wars are not won by believing harder or fighting braver or maneuver more brilliantly. They are won by the side that can bring more resources to bear, more consistently, with better efficiency. The side that turns warfare into an industrial problem and solves it through engineering and production and logistics. The VT fuse was merely one expression of that principle. A small cylindrical object containing vacuum tubes and batteries and a transmitter, manufactured by the millions, employed by adequately trained soldiers, creating effects that tactical genius could not overcome. It armed the sky above the Ardennes in December 1944, and in arming the sky, it helped end the war. Not through valor or strategy or operational art, but through something simpler and more final. The mathematics of industrial supremacy applied to the problem of killing efficiently. The truth arrived in fragments of steel, detonating precisely where physics demanded. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, the equation had already been solved. The snow still falls in the Ardennes each winter. The forest grows thick where battles were fought. The names on memorials fade with time and weather. But the lesson remains, written in the language of mathematics and industrial capacity and the cold logic of physics applied to war. Some truths cannot be defeated by courage. They can only be acknowledged.